I'm Liz Willen. I'm the editor of the Hechinger Report. We are a nonprofit, foundation-funded news organization based right here at Teachers College. You can find our regular reporting on education at www.hechingerreport.org. And we're really happy to be here to talk about Elizabeth's great book. It's exciting for us to see the kinds of things that we talk about and write about and report about every day be front and center of the education debate. And particularly this book is doing really well, and it's a great read. So I highly recommend you read it and you have a chance to ask some questions of a great panelist here. So Elizabeth's book is sparking a dialogue about some really central questions in the education debate that I hope are of great interest to this audience. Growing alarm over the quality of our national teaching force, how efforts to change it have left us, including new accountability measures, have left us, in her words, with no real plan. So Elizabeth's book gives us a sort of a great history lesson along the way. It discusses whether the most effective teachers are born for the blackboard, provides a close-up view of some really incredible teachers, including Andy, sitting right here, who are teaching for understanding, and yet also concludes that far too often, teaching doesn't work at all. But Elizabeth thinks with proper training, we can do much better. So she's going to give us a little bit of an overview, because she has been spending flying all over from Germany to Japan to Michigan to really get at this question and share some of her findings.
Thank you so much for having me. Thank you, Susan. I started this project actually when I was a Spencer Fellow at Columbia. So I would come walk up north, those like very long blocks, to Teachers College, where I had several different mentors, including many people who helped me with this project. So it's really cool to be here. So what we're going to do is I'm going to talk for 10 minutes about my book. So 300 plus pages in 10 minutes. And then we get to have a conversation, first the three of us, and then everyone here. So in 10 minutes, how I'm going to summarize is by boiling it down to 4 takeaways for you, Cliff's Notes. So takeaway number 1, who am I? And as my grandmother sometimes asked me in the process of writing this book, what the hell do you know about teaching? My grandmother was a school teacher herself and really believes in me and my work, I think. So I started this project when I got an assignment from the New York Times Magazine to write about teacher effectiveness. And it made sense to them to give me this assignment. I had been covering education for several years then for national and local publications. So of course I would know something about teaching. Well, in the course of taking on that assignment, I realized that was a bad assumption for the New York Times Magazine to make. Since doing this project, at my news organization, Chalkbeat, we've decided that there are 5 key storylines every education reporter should cover, the 5 things that drive achievement for kids. Teaching and learning is one of them. Also, the systems that support good teaching and the out-of-school context that kids bring to school. But I realized when I got this assignment that I was covering 5 storylines, all of which were politics, 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 and I knew nothing about what happened in classrooms. So I wanted to take on this project because as I learned about teaching, I realized that not only did I not know anything about it, but also my misunderstanding had really serious consequences for the way I wrote about policy. And I think that our whole discourse is that way. We're very distanced from teaching and learning, and as a result, the policies we make don't support it. So my second point, what the hell is teaching? Teaching actually requires specialized knowledge and skill. I have a few examples that I have prepared to share with you guys about this, but they require some audience participation. So please get ready, I'm gonna quiz you. This is an example that was given to me by one of the characters in the book. She asked me first, what is 49 times 5? Does anyone wanna venture a guess?
Can we use a calculator?
No calculators.
245.
245, you're right.
Yeah.
You're right. You guys are awesome. You're doing really well. That's question number 1. I also got that one right, just saying. Question number 2, why would a student think that 49 times 5 is 405? Because they're reading it left to right. So like they took 49 times 5 and they just changed the 9 into a 0 and made it like left to right 405. 405 is what I said.
Okay.
That would definitely make sense. Yes, another. Speak loudly.
They carry the 4 and multiply first the carried number and
You're really close, but you're not quite right. But this question also stumped me. It turns out that when you create a bunch of questions like this, that they're the sort of thing that teachers need to know in order to teach effectively, professional mathematicians are also stumped. They just don't, this is not a part of knowing math, but it is a part of teaching math. You're kind of, the way, it's that they added the carried 4 to the 4 to get 8, and then multiply, maybe that's what you were saying, so I guess we have a great math teacher in the audience, but maybe not a mathematician. So this is, many people in this room will be familiar with the term that describes this kind of knowledge, pedagogical content knowledge. It applies not just to math teaching, but to other subjects. Like, as an adult reader, I know that to pronounce read, the EA is pronounced E, but to pronounce break, the same EA combination is pronounced in a different way. But I have no idea why that is or in what patterns that appears. Teachers need to know that in order to teach students to read. So teaching requires specialized knowledge. Teaching also requires specialized skill. So the kind of folks who study pedagogical content knowledge are sort of one group of people that I write about in my book. Another is the entrepreneurial educators who often teach in charter schools. And they taught me the same lesson through a different kind of teaching, but the same lesson. They have given up trying to just find great teachers who are naturally born. Instead, they have invested in training teachers in these specialized skills. And both camps, for both of these camps, the teaching that they do does not come naturally. In fact, it's always unnatural. So whether it's Doug Lemov encouraging teachers to go against their instincts about how to quiet down a room, or Deborah Ball telling teachers that they have to know more than just math. They have to know how students misunderstand math. Teaching requires specialized knowledge and skill. So that's my second point. My third point, we're halfway through, is that we do not treat teaching this way at all. Our policies instead do the exact opposite. So this is true both in higher education, pre-service training, before people become teachers, and it's true once they become teachers. So one example, since we're a few steps away from Thorndike Hall, one of the challenges I learned is that we have a legacy of education research and education researchers who not only are disinterested in teaching or uninterested in teaching, but they find it boring, as Thorndike himself said, about being assigned to a practice school, and they don't want to have anything to do with it. So when Thorndike, the father of educational psychology and seminal figure clearly in the foundation of education schools, was asked one day by a group of principals and teachers what he would do about a real-life problem that principal had just experienced that day in school. Thorndike told this person, I'd resign. He had no interest in thinking about real-world school problems, and he thought that teaching was, as one of his colleagues called it, common sense. So We do not treat teaching like it's a specialized skill, not even the founders of educational psychology do. And then once teachers get into classrooms, the culture is a culture, as many people in this room know, of privacy. So one person who I talked to for my book told me when he was inducted into the profession, his mentor apologized. You know, the mentor, the person assigned to help you learn to teach, apologized that he had to observe this person teaching. He said, the mentor said to him, teaching is the second most private act. I do not want to watch you do it, but I'm going to have to do it now because I'm required to, but I'm never going to do it again. So we don't treat teaching like a specialized skill. We treat it like Victorian era sex, and that's a problem. And my final point is that it is possible to treat teaching differently. I do have some hope for our ability to change the way we treat teaching. Could you go backwards? Okay, all right. So I'm gonna tell you one story to explain my optimism. It's a story I tell in the book. How many people in this room know Magdalene Lampert?
After reading your book, absolutely.
Okay, now we know how many books we're gonna sell tonight. Just kidding. So Magdalene Lampert is a teacher, educator, and currently teacher of teacher educators at the Boston Teacher Residency. But there was a period about 10 years ago when she lost hope for our country and for our ability to change the way we treat teaching, to really treat it like a craft. She thought it's just not possible in our context. We cannot make it be that we can teach all teachers to do what they need to be taught to do. So she did what all good professors, I think, do. She took a sabbatical to Rome, where she decided to drown her sorrows by going to having some wine and taking Italian classes and walking around along the river. And one day, she's in Italian class at a school called Italia Idea, learning Italian, when something strange happens. She's in this class, and the teacher has been teaching for about 10 minutes, whatever the planned lesson was, when all of a sudden he steps outside of the room, takes about a minute break, comes back, and gives the whole class a new assignment. This is maybe unremarkable to all of you, but Magdalene Lampert is a master teacher, and she recognized a fellow master when she saw one. What he had done was he had recognized that the students weren't understanding the task that they had prepared to do, and they were struggling with something else instead. They were struggling with subject-verb agreement, not with the meaning of different, the specific words on this assignment. So he left the room, got a new task that focused on subject-verb agreement, and redirected them. That was remarkable to her, and it was also remarkable when she saw the same teacher do the same thing multiple times. He kept teaching in this really ambitious, very successful way. And what was thirdly remarkable was this school had many teachers who cycled through classes. So one group of students would get a new teacher every 3 weeks. And every single teacher she had at this school did the same thing. And she started to think, why? How? How have you done the thing that I decided just isn't possible at your Italian school in Rome? And she came to realize that what was going on was something she called infrastructure. So in transportation, infrastructure is the stuff that helps us, that we don't think about, but that helps us move people to places. So we can do complex things, like last week I was in, I don't know where I was, Tennessee, and this week I'm in New York, and between that I was in Boston. And it's because of speed limits and roads and bridges and FAA regulations that made all of that seamlessly possible. Well, at Italia Idea, she thought something similar was going on. But instead of a transportation infrastructure, it was an educational infrastructure. So I'm going to close by describing how that worked, because this is, I think, the key idea that I hope we can talk about. How can we create this in this country? So at the heart of the infrastructure at Italia Idea was how many people recognize this diagram? The instructional triangle, a formidable piece of education research. The teacher and the students are learning together. Now, can you go to yeah. So the key was that the teacher was surrounded at Italia Idea by an infrastructure to support ambitious teaching that really helps students learn. So for example, let's take the circle that says material and technical resources. What allowed the teacher to leave the classroom and 1 minute later come back with a different lesson? It was the fact that at Italia Idea, the teachers shared a lesson bank of lessons that they all created together and could all share and draw on together. Something else, that TE stands for teacher education. She discovered, as she turned her sabbatical into a research project, as professors do, that Italia Idea, all teachers came from the same teacher education program, dedicated to training teachers of Italian. And at that teacher education program, teachers learned the practices and knowledge that they needed to help Magdalene and her peers learn Italian. A third thing, the organization of work. The time in the teacher's work was structured so that they had the time to create a lesson bank that he could turn to. And they had the time not only to create it, but to work with each other to create it. So all of these pieces were in place. I think all of them are in place in high-performing countries like Japan and Finland. I think they're in place in high-performing networks of charter and district schools like New Visions for Public Schools or Achievement First in New York City, or Uncommon Schools where Doug Lamov works. And I think this is what gives me hope about where our country can go. Too often our policies are reforms being acted on individual teachers. This is a kind of approach that says, instead of acting on individuals, let's think about a system. So, thank you. Let's talk.
Thank you so much, Elizabeth. It's really interesting. There's a great lesson there about an aha moment that comes after you spend time in Italy and drink a lot of wine and walk along the river. But that's not possible for all of us. So I'm curious, Susan, what really struck you about some of these particular lessons?
Well, I have my own stories about the people in this book. And actually, as Elizabeth and Andy encouraged me to tell them because we spoke on the phone first, I think Elizabeth gives language to and makes accessible this kind of teaching, which is so hard to describe. I was on the advisory panel for that center at Michigan State. Lee Shulman chaired it, and they kept talking about disseminating their work about this kind of teaching or teaching for understanding, and they could never explain what it was in words. And I kept trying to help them, like, say what it's not, try to be clear about what it is if you're going to describe it and try to promote it. And I wish they had you helping them then to put into words, because you know it when you see it. When Deborah is with a group of policymakers, I've been with her in that situation many times.
You're talking about Deborah Ball, the president of the University of Michigan, a central figure, of the education school, yeah.
Right. She will give them a problem to illustrate the kind of mathematical content knowledge that, or mathematical knowledge for teaching that she's talking about. So the problem I like is that when you're trying to teach dividing one fraction by another fraction, she asks the children to put that into a word problem. Now, you try that. Dividing a half into 2/3, for example, put it into a word problem, and it's no easy feat, and most of the legislators were unable to do it. So she makes the point, and I think what's so exciting is her work now in Teaching Works at the University of Michigan, where she's trying to develop a curriculum for teacher education, where what she calls the high leverage practices are specified and taught to new teachers. And the way that Elizabeth's been saying, there's sets of knowledge and skills that new teachers have to know. Things like how to lead a discussion, how to understand and respond to patterns of thinking in children within subject areas, how to elicit student thinking, how to model and represent. These are all skills and based in knowledge that teachers need in their arsenal. So it's reinforces the point. Good teachers are not born, but they can learn. So.
They're not born, but according to Elizabeth's book, one of the best in the city is right here. He was at the School of the Future, and now Andy is a teacher at Harvest Collegiate, which I first thought was a prep school. The name does sound like a prep school, but it's actually a public school, a high school in Chelsea. Andy was a pivotal figure in Elizabeth's book because he told her that if she didn't teach as part of the book, she would be a fraud. And so on page 314 of her book, in the epilogue, you will see what happened when Elizabeth tried to teach at School of the Future and really gained appreciation for what it takes. But people repeatedly told Elizabeth that Andy was the best teacher he'd ever seen. His whiteboard is apparently legendary. I checked out some of his reviews on ratemyteacher.com, and they were indeed raves. But you certainly weren't born that way, Andy, so I'd love to hear your reaction to some of the things that build upon making a great teacher.
We're trying to figure out how to make teachers more effective. We're trying to help students get deeper understandings and get stronger capacities. And how do we do that? And part of what Elizabeth is talking about is that we need to work on a system-wide level, not on just a teacher-by-teacher level, and not just by sort of putting pressure on teachers, right? But then still there is something quite individual. Even in Elizabeth's books, in her book here, we find out about how Deborah Ball was such a great teacher from day one. And so there's this sort of weird thing where it is about an individual teacher, but it's that teacher within a larger matrix. So I guess I would say a couple of points I'd want to emphasize are that we have to change the matrix that the teachers are working in. And I'm guessing this row of people here might be all working together. So that kind of a matrix where you have people who go to book talks and try to hear something new that they're going to work together.
Wait, are they from your school, Andy?
No, ma'am. I've got my student teachers here, but that's the only one. So that kind of a matrix, right, where you have teachers who go out together, get ideas together, hash over the ideas together, try them out, figure out what works, pass those on to the other teachers at the school. That's the kind of a matrix which supports the development of teachers. Everybody trying to figure it out on their own, you can do great stuff. I did really fun stuff when I was teaching down in Naples, Florida by myself, but you don't grow as fast and you don't grow as deep. So a point that Elizabeth's book, I think, really emphasizes is that if we can change the matrix in which teachers are working, then we can change what those teachers are capable of. And a key point there I just would want to illustrate. I like making my own curriculum. It's a really fun thing to do. You sort of self-expression. You get to, whatever you're obsessed with, you get to get the students obsessed with also, and then change it the next semester. But one of the best courses I've taught was a course called Looking for an Argument, which was invented by this guy Avram Barlow over at Urban Academy. Because my school is part of the consortium, which is against standardized tests. It's a consortium that tries to do performance-based assessment. And Avram is a genius, and he invented this course, which is basically about teaching kids to think and to reason and to argue by modeling, by taking hot topics and having the students debate them, and then ultimately learning to write persuasive essays, very Common Core aligned. And Avram's course was powerful, and it was probably more effective than a lot of the courses that I've designed. And I was able to tweak it, and I was able to edit it. But because I was building on Avram's course, my students got something better than if I had just invented that by myself. And because Avram shared that course through the consortium and other ways, lots of us, there's I think at least 10 schools in the city that are teaching this course. So I think that speaks to what Elizabeth's talking about, that we need to set up those conditions where the best practices can spread, and that those best practices are always being further refined. It doesn't have to be robotic. And I'll just name one more example of that real quick. Social studies, we've had a hard time. You know, these Regents exams are frankly terrible. Anybody who's taught towards those Regents exams, it's really a trivia test. They make you, the world history one, they make you do 5,000 years of history and 85 multiple choice questions. It absolutely kills students' interest in understanding what's going on. But now New York State has revised its standards and incorporated a movement called C3 into it. And C3, a friend of mine, Kathy Swan, was one of the main writers of that. It argues we have a clear purpose of social studies. Social studies is to help people become good citizens. Okay, so how do we do that? We teach them to be good citizens by letting them practice be good citizens. What do good citizens do? They ask questions. They do research. They figure out how to take action together. So if we can do that with our students, day by day, month by month, by the end of their high school experience, these students will be ready to be really good citizens. And that kind of very clear sense of our purpose, which isn't about gaming a test, it's not about increasing teacher, even rate my teacher outcomes, but a clear sense of a purpose, and then people sharing, as in New York we're doing right now, people are writing new curriculum and sharing their curriculum. Sharing best practices based on that clear sense of purpose, I think, has the possibility to revolutionize not just what every student is getting, but also to help the best teachers refine their practice and the least good teachers to get at least mediocre.
That sounds great. Susan, what are some of the barriers preventing the situations that Andy is describing? Are they policy? Are they, what's getting in the way?
It's what Elizabeth described. It's the incoherence of the system, you know, the people teaching whatever they want instead of an agreed upon body of content, and then being able to refine their pedagogy around this content, the way that lesson study in Japan takes place, and learn from one another in teaching that content. The divorce between what we teach and what we assess. The divorce between what teachers are learning in professional development, where they're maybe spending more time, but are learning and doing things that are often disconnected and not focused on what the students will learn. So the system was not constructed to be coherent. I mean, David Cohn argues that this dates back to our founding. You know, we deliberately built a nation that was intended to be a bulwark against tyranny. There was going to be no one system here in anything. It was going to be a very dispersed, localized system, and we now have 50 states, 100,000 schools, or whatever it is, and this has persisted despite all efforts to bring more rationality and coherence. Unfortunately, rationality and coherence can easily tip over into standardization and control, and finding the balance is really difficult.
It continues to be so difficult here, but Elizabeth, you really make a lot of points in your book about how smooth this is in Japan, and where you really found that kind of collaborative teaching. What can we learn from that?
Yeah, so I actually have to admit that when I was writing the book, there was one part I was really afraid of what Andy would think about it, and I only just now realized that he is on board, so. Yeah. So in Japan, there is this coherence, right? There's a course of study every 10 years it gets revised, but every 10 years it gets revised with the input of some of the best teachers in the country, as agreed by their peers. So like in our country, we might have, a committee that the AFT and the NEA have to appoint, that have to be in a certain place in Washington to work on the Common Core standards for a weekend where they get chicken dinner or whatever. But in Japan, it seems really much more authentic than that. It really, the teachers can tell you oh, like that guy over there, he wrote this textbook and he's on the course of study committee. I think that one of the takeaways for me is like we just have to get over our problem with things being common. Like we're so afraid of things being top down, and what that prevents is things being shared. So my fear was that Andy, I was there and I was thinking, I wonder if we could get like a common curriculum. Am I allowed to think that? What will my teacher friends tell me when I tell them that I wonder if we need a national curriculum, for example? And I kept asking the teachers in Japan that, like, is your creativity squashed? Are you held back by this? And they all believed that they were maestros. They all believed that they were doing it differently than any other teacher in Japan. I thought about the art form of haiku. It's like the most controlled possible art form that you could imagine, but within it there's a ton of creativity. So I think that the questions I have now are like, what is politically feasible and what is desirable too? Because how do we feel about having something very common that in the context of a democracy?
Well, that's been a big issue that's come up in the Common Core curriculum. It's passed by more than 40 states now, but it's still far from being a smooth implementation. I'd love to hear from both of you a little bit about whether that sort of furthers these goals or complicates them or gets us closer. Do you want to try that first, Andy?
And then he just tossed it over to me. I think the idea was that it was supposed to further the goals of greater coherence. And I think that a lot of the backlash has less to do with the essential notion of commonness than with many other things, the federalization of it, the specific things in the standards that a number of content people object to, the rush toward implementation, many other things. And of course, we'll always have, a Texas who doesn't want to teach about climate change, but there'd still be a large body of common things that if all those other issues had not arisen, we might have agreed on. And it might be that we just have to try a number of times. That, it's a cycle, and we will hopefully move toward more commonness over time, because we need some sort of anchor for all these other policies, to provide teachers a realm in which creativity can then take place.
Andy?
Well,
Pained. You look pained. This is a tough topic.
It's an interesting, I'm looking at these folks here. We love to make great curriculum, and we don't trust the people in Albany or wherever who make most of the decisions. So the state social studies standards were recently revised, and what's wonderful about that is it includes the C3, this national movement to make our social studies more coherent and to be for a clear purpose and to use this inquiry arc, which is straight out of John Dewey, oh bless his name. But the C3 does not state specific curriculum that should be followed, but New York State does, and unfortunately New York State sets pages and pages and 50 pages of curriculum that has to be covered. And if you're doing 50 pages of curriculum, you are just covering it, and then you might as well just bury it because the students are not going to remember it. Right. So we don't trust those kind of national curriculums, and I think for good reason. And I think we all like the idea of assessing what the students are learning, and Common Core promises to make that clearer. But we don't really trust Common Core very much because the state assessments have been bad for so long. So how can we trust that these new assessments will be better? And then I would point out that, for instance, Avram's course was invented by Avram, who's a genius teacher at Urban Academy. It wasn't invented by a committee. So I do have some typical American fears about central control. I just want to say one thing that maybe is harder, because Elizabeth's book got me pretty excited, and I do think it's so crucial. My best friend grew up in Germany, and there they have a coherent system of education, and you can have a conversation on the street with anyone in Germany, and you can assume that they know some basic things because everyone learned them. some very important things that they should know. And, but there's this difficulty there, which is that if the common curriculum isn't beautiful, then it becomes an approximation. And Jonathan Kozol talked about this in the book that he then apologized for. But he says that the night is dark and I'm far from home is the name of that one. But he says that a lot of times people try to create the appearance of fire, but they're too scared of real fire, so they just make plastic fires. And so I went to visit Achievement First because I was so excited from what Elizabeth said about it on Monday, because I thought that'd be cool to talk about at the panel too, And they had such skill and such commitment and such purposefulness, and it was so well sort of constructed and it was aligned from grade to grade, but a lot of it did not feel like real fire. A lot of it felt like approximating, like we're going to have the students wrestle with the text and then discuss it, but at one point one of the classes was talking about The Outsiders and nobody was crying, even though we were at the point with Pony Boy, and like that's also a problem. So I think we need common curriculum, and maybe that can be decentralized. Maybe Achievement First makes one great version and the state makes another, but then we need to remember that the spirit killeth, the letter killeth, but the spirit giveth life. That there has to be this animating spirit of beauty, and that this is worth it in and of itself, not just because it's going to increase test scores. Thank you.
Okay. Yeah, well, okay, now I'm thinking, Susan said really interestingly and provocatively, well, maybe the opposition to the Common Core will mean that this is sort of one iteration and then something else will come next. So I really want to know from you, what would that look like in practice? And then related to that from you, Andy, because I've been thinking a lot about how do we get there? People keep asking me, so they force me to think about it, but we also should all think about it. And one option is Common Core sort of style, like everyone in the whole country agrees to create a massive national infrastructure. Like we'll have better assessments and common standards, and Deborah Ball will get all of the university-based teacher education programs to adopt a single teacher education curriculum. And that really appeals to me in part. But the other option is, what if there are sort of coalitions, smaller groups that sort of bottom up start to have their own infrastructure? And that's already happening. So, at Achievement First, they have their own infrastructure. You could argue that Achievement First is part of a somewhat larger family that includes Uncommon Schools, KIPP. Or you could say that if you're in them, you say, absolutely not, we're different families and we have competing ways of thinking about it. But then you could say, New Visions is over here and Boston Teacher Residency is creating their own little network. And what if that's the way? Maybe that's the most American way to get to commonness is through competing. But that one worries me too. So that what's worrisome about the centralized option is maybe obvious, like what Andy is making us all applaud about. Everyone loves beauty. But what's scary about the sort of bottom-up approach to me is it excludes the most disadvantaged students almost by design. So the common thing that...
By design is a little harsh.
Anyway, okay, so I'm going to stop talking. Those are my questions.
Yeah. Well, bottom-up is always appealing, and it's a very long-term strategy, and we have kids to worry about now. So, anything I might say about taking the long view, raises the question about what about the children in school now? Yeah. But if you look at a lot of the policy changes in American education, they have taken 40 or 50 years to shape out in different ways. I started my career in the school finance reform movement, which was very new in the 70s, the notion that states should really step up to this commitment to making a student's education not depend on their zip code. And there was a lot of movement. Then there was some slippage in the 80s and 90s, and then movement again, and a redefinition of equity to include adequacy, so it's not just making it equal, but that the amount has to be enough. And our ideas about finance have gradually changed. This is not to say that there's equal funding everywhere, or that we've achieved what we want to achieve, but we certainly have gotten closer. And along the way, and this is, I should put in a plug for my main love, which is research, along the way, we studied what happened and learned from it, and that's something that we've not done at all with the Common Core. And there's been a lot of resistance to funding implementation studies on it. I think that the people who have supported it know that the findings aren't going to be wonderful, but there are some studies, California, where actually implementation has been proceeding much better, it appears, has launched a major multi-university study following the implementation. Maybe we'll learn some things about how that could work, even though it originated from afar. So.
There's been a lot of questions about whether also there should have been research in advance, field testing. That seems to have been a big issue before implementation. I'm curious if any of you feel like that would have made a big difference at all in helping create a little bit more public understanding around it.
We knew what to do. We didn't want to put the money or the time into it. You know how much professional development is involved. You know how much curriculum has to be in advance. I mean, that we didn't, those are lessons we've learned a long time ago. And Race to the Top said you had to spend the money right away, and it was never enough, and not everybody got it. And other states and localities did not put the money into it, not the support, and had to test and evaluate teachers right away, as Race to the Top rushed that all through. So, the whole concept of commonness got damaged by all these other things and by...
And I feel like, and I'd like you guys to add to this, but the whole debate of the Common Core has so gotten caught up with the way teachers are evaluated in the test scores. And that is something you saw in your book, and it's something you hear about all the time. Susan and Andy, you, I'm sure, see that as a teacher and with the evaluations. I'd love to hear, since we're really talking about here how to get a more effective teacher, is the way that we're trying to evaluate them now, and is it tied to the Common Core a roadblock or going to help us get better teachers? Do you want to take a stab at that first, Andy?
If we want to make better teaching, which I think is the goal, even more important than better teachers, right? If we want to make better teaching, then we have to figure out how to motivate that increase, that improvement in our practice, which is, as your book points out, complex, right? It's not easy what we're trying to do. The idea of reducing that complexity to a test score on a test that has zero credibility with anybody who's paid attention to it, and unfortunately in New York State we used to grade our own tests, so we knew exactly how bad they were, that the Albany provided for us, makes it, that's pretty discouraging. If you're being evaluated based on a test that you know is terrible, and you have no say in that, and that Bloomberg is insisting that it's is managing to get this in the newspaper, and that this is going to become the, that's really discouraging. And I think we can point some of the backlash against Common Core isn't even particularly about Common Core, it's about this sort of climate of disrespect and antagonism that certain politicians have made political capital off of. That being said, clearly there needs to be big change. Eric had an essay in Chalkbeat today that we need visionary change. We can't just sort of do these little moves and expect things to be a lot different. But I would like to point out C3 again as a model, and I think C3 might be getting some Race to the Top money from New York State.
Can you just briefly explain what C3 is in case people don't know?
C3 is, the common thought about schools, which is, if you think about it, devastatingly awful, that it's just for college and careers. It tries to say, well, it's also for civic engagement.
Third C.
So the third C is civic engagement and citizenship, and NCSS, the National Council for Social Studies, has adopted C3 as sort of its idea of how social studies instruction should happen. So it's pretty major, and it's got a bunch of states have now signed on. So it's spreading. Now you could say it's grassroots a little bit because my friend Steve is helping to write model curriculum, and I'm helping to review the model curriculum. But once we've got the model curriculum, it will be spread, and New York State is supporting this effort. And there you see, I think, something quite nice. You see a state providing resources to help genius people, like Kathy Swan, who is the lead writer, has genius, who then recruits other great people who then actually try out what they're going to do before they foist it on other teachers' classrooms, and with a very clear sense of purpose that we're teaching our students an inquiry cycle. We're teaching them how to take an interest, find out about, measure, evaluate sources, and figure out which ones we should believe, then take action or communicate conclusions. And it all sort of makes so much sense for what we want to do if we're trying to teach civic engagement. And that's being helped by the New York State. New York State has done this. John King is the one who I think made this happen, and made sure that it would be well funded. And if New York State develops great curriculum for C3 and other states start to use that, that might be quicker than 40 or 50 years.
Can I jump in about
especially
evaluation though? Because that's a really pretty picture, but I'll just play devil's advocate.
Devil already has too many advocates.
Okay, I was just in a district that I won't name talking to one of those behind the scenes people who makes everything happen. And the person told me about evaluations that, oh, we're doing great work in this district. We are about to evaluate out 100 teachers in the district. And I said, oh, evaluate out. You mean evaluate, just evaluate. Like you accidentally said the word out. No, like evaluate out. That is, so some people wonder what the purpose of teacher evaluations is. And I write about a study of district leaders who are implementing Race to the Top programs and teacher evaluation programs in their states. They were asked, what is the purpose of teacher evaluation? And some of them, like 50% of them were like, the purpose is to help give teachers the feedback they need to improve, identify those who need professional development, and then give it to them. But others were like, the purpose of teacher evaluation is to deselect, to identify the teachers who are the bottom of the barrel. So I say this because it's the easy thing to say, sort of the, I don't know, beautiful thing would be, no, let's let all the teachers can be better. And, you know, my book sort of argues many teachers can be better. But I do think that I would put back to both of you, maybe there are 100 teachers in a district who you wouldn't want as your colleagues, who it is, even though evaluation is not really effective at all in helping people get better, maybe it is effective in evaluating out the people who just shouldn't be there.
But shouldn't it be effective at getting people,
Well, I mean,
making them better?
You yourself saw a very effective system in Pam Grossman's Plato system. So there are effective approaches to evaluation. Obviously, we're not doing it, and you know, almost anywhere that I know of. I mean, you keep hearing stories like Cleveland, maybe. There are a few places that are doing it, and the new union contract here in New York City seems to have some interesting possibilities with respect to evaluation, which we're going to have to follow and hope that there's good implementation around that. So, you know, it can be done well. Did we do it well in the past? No. It was pro forma, it was a stupid checklist, and, you know, it wasn't real. Are we doing it well now, relying on test scores? No. But it's not an impossible task, so.
Well, Pam Grossman, though, would say Plato is not evaluation, and it was first an evaluation, then she completely redesigned it to be professional development.
But it could be an evaluation improvement system. If we thought of evaluation, because look, even if they're assuming there are some people who shouldn't be teaching and you just as soon counsel them out, surely there are going to be much larger numbers who we'd like to improve. And, you know, that's the purpose of a system, to help them improve.
Yeah, and it's a little more complicated than evaluating them out. There is this thing called tenure. It's going to be really complicated and volatile. And are you writing this story, or can we look forward to reading this, or is it, did he not mean to say that to you? Counsel
It was off
out.
the record.
Great. Well, I want to do a little quick lightning round because I know there's a lot of teachers in the audience, and these are really complicated and important issues, and I'm sure there are a lot of questions, and I do want to turn it over. But a couple of things I'd be remiss about. One, if Andy is such a great teacher, I just want you to know what was said about him in Rate My Teacher. So we have a sense of what does make a great teacher, because I'm going to ask each of you to answer that. Every class is an adventure with Andy. Teaches you something new every day. gives a midterm and final as a fallback plan if you fail, but don't assume you're going to pass. You got a 5.0, easiness 4.0, helpfulness 3.0. So they have their own set of evaluation there. Very good teacher, down to earth and funny, teaches important things in life, not just school. Academically rigorous, intellectually challenging, and inspiring to boot. Too much to have hoped for. So you got some really nice compliments, Andy. I'd love to know, in a nutshell, from each of you, what do we need to do to make better teachers? And then you also have to tell us how Elizabeth did in your classroom.
I asked I teach an advisory class, and I asked them what's the most important thing for effective teaching. And they were pretty clear. There was one dissenter, which is nice, but they were pretty clear that a sense of openness, that you're actually paying attention, you're encountering the other person, this student, as a learner, as an equal, as a valuable human being, not as just someone who's sitting in front of you while you go about and do your show. That was very important for these students. The dissenter emphasized strictness. It was also good. I think that we should think about what makes great teaching, and I think part of it is that there's a real sense of passion about that there's a sense of almost mysterious power to what's being taught, that it matters so much, that it's urgent and it's life-changing. And if the teacher believes that, and if it's true, then I think you can help the students see that. But if the teacher sees what he or she is doing is just moves so that the student will be able to then do this, who can then do this, and then do this, but that it itself doesn't matter so much. The students, they'll play the game, but they're not passionate. So I'd say Elizabeth, I think, does have the chance to be a great teacher because she really deeply cares. She came in to help with a biography unit that I was doing, and she not only cares deeply about doing biography, but she's also done biography, and she also cares deeply, like you see even here, she's supposed to be talking for her book talk, but she's trying to ask us questions.
She's a journalist.
She's a journalist. So this sort of belief in the importance of what you're doing, I would say, is a crucial capacity that good teachers have, and Elizabeth certainly has, and this ability to listen as sort of this process goes on is also very crucial. And we see here this book where Elizabeth sort of sets the groundwork, I think, for her future journalism, to see how these efforts this book says, here's the history and here's what's been going on, and now the future journalism should be about figuring out what's working and how can we get there. And that ability to keep paying attention, to believe that it's crucially important, Elizabeth has, so I think she has the crucial capacity for a great teacher.
You hear that capacity, not existing ability.
Susan?
So it's really hard to use one word because obviously love of children as well as your subject. But if I had to pick one word, it would be practice in the Carnegie Hall sense of the word. How do you get to?
You can have more than one word.
How do you get to Carnegie Hall? Practice is. So, but in that sense, that teachers need to learn how to teach, and it requires a lot of knowledge and theory and practicing specific approaches tied to their subjects, and that they can practice over and over again with good mentorship. So I believe in long field experiences, as we have here, or plentiful field experiences in residencies. And I did mention to the two of you early on the phone that new research is showing that our old beliefs that teachers sort of plateau after 3 to 5 years and don't get better with more experience is being challenged by some newer findings. There's a Helen Ladd study out of North Carolina that shows that teachers are continuing to improve throughout their careers when given the opportunity to practice in an informed sense. They keep on learning.
That is really promising. And on that optimistic note, I'm going to argue that Elizabeth had her whole book to tell us about what makes a better teacher, and I'm going to open it up to the audience.
I have a relatively practical question, which is you showed that beautiful infrastructure slide earlier. I think a lot of us are trying to impact change within an existing one. So can you help us to prioritize? Or like, what's like the thing that you would work on tomorrow if we're working within an existing infrastructure?
Yeah. Can you put the slide back up? I think that I think what's easy about the way we talk about interventions now is this individual approach of let's have a reform and let's act it upon individual teachers is really easy to prioritize around. Like, we can just push a policy button that says hold everyone more accountable, or we could hold a protest that says give us more autonomy, and it's a lot simpler. So one answer is we have to do it all, and if we don't do it all, every piece will fail. But that said, I think that I think that we spend a lot of time on incentives and evaluation. And one other thing, I'm at a university, I should cite my sources, unlike a journalist. This is by Seneca Rosenberg, who did her doctorate at the University of Michigan, and her advisor was David Cohen, who, that I'm using his term, infrastructure of practice. And you should read his book, Teaching and Its Predicaments, which I think lays out really beautifully what this infrastructure entails. But so I think that, I was just trying to make the point that maybe this anonymous district person isn't so wrong, that there is something to having a kind of cheap evaluation system that does identify low performers. I don't think there's necessarily something wrong with that, but we've spent a lot on that circle and a lot less on the others. And I think there needs to be a lot more on the others. So one, I think the induction, teacher education, and professional development is really, really important. And in the response to my book, I've gotten to meet even more institutions, whether they're inside universities or equally and more often outside of universities, that are trying to do that very differently and have hit real roadblocks to scale. So they can identify that they're creating a model that is focused very tightly on this sort of curriculum that Susan mentioned, that Deborah Ball has created, but enacting that curriculum and spreading it is so that they're teaching more future teachers is really challenging. And I think one priority is let's talk to all those folks, figure out all the roadblocks, and then identify the ones that we can remove. And I think there is a community of people working on that, but it's relatively weaker, especially compared to evaluation. I could keep talking about all this. Okay, professional development is another one, right? We invest $9 billion a year on professional development. Unless anyone in this room, and probably it would be someone in this room, can tell me a better number. That's the best one that I could find. So let's think about how to use those resources differently, and because it's not enough just to prepare teachers well when they're going to exit and enter a profession in which learning is required well beyond year 1, 2, and 3, and certainly beyond year 0, which is going to potentially and often unlearn the good education they had at university. So it's not enough just to create the teacher education. You also have to create opportunities to learn ongoing. And then, the third thing is that I would prioritize is the material and technical resources. I think that, people like to talk about ed tech. It's really hot. There's tons of investors who are looking at that space. Well, what if we could actually make technology really useful, and in what ways would it be useful? It would be thinking about really high quality materials that support both student and teacher learning. So that's my prioritized list of a long agenda.
Okay, thank you. So I just want to say that conversation so far has been great, and I really want to appreciate the fact that we have a practicing teacher up on the panel. It's a really useful addition to this kind of conversation. I'm currently a student teacher, so every day I see the overpowering presence of preparing for the exams, for the Regents exams, and how much that affects what the teachers can do. I also know that, the work you're doing, Andy, at Harvard Collegiate, places like Urban Academy as consortium schools,
Yeah.
they have exemptions from the Regents,
Yes.
and also the charter schools that Elizabeth was talking about have, in their own sense, autonomy for how they meet the requirement. So for the vast majority of schools in New York City that don't have the freedom to be a consortium school or in a charter school, what would you, Andy, or Elizabeth talk about finding the space for great teaching and learning with these, our obsession with accountability that we now have?
Yeah, I think you have to be heroic. I think the current climate is impossible. And, hopefully it's going to change. Let's be hopeful. Look at what's changed today in New York City with the school report cards. So, already we're moving away from such an overwhelming emphasis on test scores, and I just hope that continues.
Great question. I think maybe you've just asked, at least from the people I spend time with, the most important question. I don't have any super great answer. I have a lot of pity for the people who are in the position of wanting to give the best that they possibly can to their students and instead having to do test prep. And this black box model that Elizabeth attacks in her book, this idea that we can just measure how much students learn by looking at the test at the end of the year and not by what they actually learn. When the test is not great, when the test is not amazing, you get this deformation, this mutilation of real learning where it becomes just, I've seen great teachers. I was at KIPP a couple years ago, really great teachers running through PowerPoint slides. It was terrible to see. So I would say the thing that you would expect me to say, try to smuggle in, as much as you can of the real stuff. But I don't have any smart answer. The hope is for New York State that the social studies exams will be revised within the next 4 to 5 years. So at least in social studies, there will be hopefully more meaningful tests, and we should push hard for that.
Yeah, I think that people talk about teacher voice, and what they mean is teacher voice in the political dialogue. I think that sometimes that becomes fetishized in a way that reduces that voice to a token or not a really meaningful contribution. I think that what makes it possible for us as journalists to help teachers influence the system is having you there. Like, don't give up, stay, and think about how to influence the policy debate so that you're not saying something that gets interpreted as I don't want to be accountable for students learning, because you do want to be accountable for students learning, and so that you're not saying I just want to be alone with the kids, because we know that's also I'm alone to make it up by myself. That's also not right. But what about a message that it helps people understand why this everyday experience isn't working the way it is, and what are the consequences for students learning? And I think that's a story that is hard for the rest of the public to see. It's really hard for policymaker types to understand. They think they're doing the right thing, and they really want to do the right thing, most of them. So I think, be a participant in the debate that way by coming up with examples of what is holding back learning that was meant to help it.
Can I just ask a very fast follow-up question? And I don't know the answer to this, but how much of the pressure for these terrible tests and these dumb accountability systems comes from corporate interests who are profiting off of this?
That is a question that a lot of us are looking at in our day-to-day journalism, but I don't think that there's sort of an answer in your book or an easy answer to that one.
But I think a lot less than we worry about. A lot less than you would worry about. I think, to me, the most meaningful place that it comes from and the place worth engaging with is, okay, so I started thinking a lot in Japan about who is the end user of a test and what is the purpose of the test. Like in this country, the end user of the test is the bureaucrat. And the purpose of the test is to hand the bureaucrat a dashboard, right? Like I'm a manager now, I'm actually a CEO, so I have a dashboard. I get it. You need a dashboard to manage a system. You need to know, like, basically, is it working or is it not? Where are the problem areas? That is why our tests were designed. And that's maybe okay. I'm not sure how I feel about it. It's maybe okay. But we're using the tests for other things too, like not just the CEO dashboard so that like, not Carmen, but so that Joel Klein could know which schools to just crush and Eric Nadelstern sitting here could say, let's do it a different way. But that's the purpose of our test. But now we're saying, let's also use those tests as diagnostic tools to help teachers improve their practice. Let's also use them to have like results that are going to influence teaching. And so the test becomes the whole infrastructure. Like in the absence of a strong infrastructure, we have what David Cohen calls an exoskeleton, which is what accountability has given us, which is like if infrastructure is like a human, exoskeleton is like a skeleton.
You've also noticed that we could use them to not counsel someone out, but to evaluate someone out.
Yeah, so I think that that's really why accountability has been created and why it exists, and I don't think corporate interests are the main driver.
We have a question here.
Yeah, Elizabeth, I really enjoyed your book. It was a terrific book. I was a little upset when you talked about the testing evaluating out. And I don't think we have to evaluate out because they're leaving.
Yeah, that's a great point.
UFT paper, 41% within 5 years. Actually, that's lower.
That's lower.
That's lower. It had been 50%. In charter schools, they had a major piece several months ago in the Times that the average stay in a charter school was 2.3 years. So how can we build a matrix when everyone is heading toward the door? So how can, I think a big issue, and it's never been addressed as far as I know by the DOE, they have to keep hiring and hiring and hiring. How do we retain teachers? And I think that Japanese model, which takes time and money, is one way of doing it.
Yeah, and let me be, the reason I was like, snap my fingers like, oh shucks, when you said I couldn't give my answer to building a better teachers, I just want to clarify that my devil's advocate comment about evaluation. I guess I think that evaluation maybe is part of the puzzle, and definitely some people should not be teaching, but I think we massively overestimate how many people that is or could be, because there's 3.7 million teachers in this country. Given the turnover that you just mentioned, now I don't know how to look at your face because you disappeared. Oh, hi. Given the turnover, we're going to have 1 million more teachers in the next decade. So it's not only not fair to most teachers to give this impression that the reason that we have the learning outcomes we do is that there's all these like lazy teachers like lying on their desks that we just need to evaluate out. But it's also just impractical as a solution if we are going to acknowledge that for every teacher we lose, we're going to get 1 million more over the next 10 years. And what are we going to do with them? And what's to guarantee that we're not going to have to evaluate them out too? So I just want to clarify what I was saying there is, and now your question is about turnover and what to do about getting higher retention.
Yes.
So I think, the Richard Ingersoll has, I think, some of the best research on teacher retention problems, and what's interesting is that teachers who leave do not cite the things we think that they would cite as the reasons for them leaving. They do not cite low pay, they cite working conditions. And I started to think a lot about that finding as I was writing this book, because what do teachers really mean by working conditions? They mean that we are asking them to do like really, really hard job and then And then on top of just asking them to do that job, and on top of not supporting them doing it, actually creating conditions that actively make it challenging to do it, and that make someone's like main question about education, like how could I even survive in this system? So I think that's what teachers probably mean by working conditions, and the only thing we can do to address that and retain teachers is to create the supports that are really what they need and what they're asking for. And yeah, that's what I think. And I think the charter school point, like just one more thing, is that they're like, look at which charter schools and where they're going, and the ones that are creating these high performing outcomes and have this strong infrastructure. I think that like it's a small number, but the teachers who move within those charters move from one to another, and then they move out because of our messed up policies to support women when they become pregnant. Frankly, not necessarily because of working conditions.